Welcome to Exploring the Ancient Forest. It's now been about 30 years since the Australian death doom band Paramaecium released their second album, Within the Ancient Forest. The lyrics to that album were based on a book, which made them very cool. In this episode, however, we're going to have a look at Paramaecium's other albums and their lyrics, and just see where that takes us. Okay, so here is the final installment of this little series on Paramaecium's lyrics. We've now reached the final Paramaecium album, Echoes from the Ground from 2004. This one doesn't really get talked about that much. I don't think many people actually listen to this album. By this time, I think Andrew Tompkins was, again, searching for musicians. Ian Arkley wasn't around this time. Jason Duran briefly rejoined the band, just kind of interesting. This time around, it clearly is a concept album again. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun to revisit this one too. And I guess you'll know why it was so much fun for me when you listen to this. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so Echoes from the Ground. Let's take an in-depth look at the lyrics to this probably least well-known Paramaecium album. First of all, I already said in the intro that Jason Duran was briefly back. He actually added some guitars. They're called additional incidental guitars to tracks 1 and 2. Otherwise, it's completely different musicians, though. And Andrew Tompkins, who is responsible for the lyrics and the concept and so on, is the only founding member here. Okay, so Echoes from the Ground tells the fictional journey of a Victorian scholar by the name of Henry Berkeley. The journey takes him to Palestine, in order to come to terms with his own faith, or with his own doubts about his faith. Just for some historical contextualization, it's the 1860s, and this was a time in which a lot of things were happening in Western Christianity. Some evangelical revivals were going on. For example, the Second Great Awakening in the United States, but also in Britain, where I guess this is supposed to be taking place. There were some major advances in biblical scholarship going on in the 19th century, which, of course, mirrored or paralleled certain advances in the natural sciences. So this was the time of Charles Darwin, for example. And more and more sacred writings from all over the place were popping up and becoming very interesting to European scholars. The writings of the Gnostics, for example, were discovered. In England itself, there had recently been a sort of restoration of the monastic life. Interestingly, an important figure here is John Henry Newman. So there was a new emphasis on community, and I think this aspect will become important towards the end of the plot line here as well. So our fictional protagonist, by the name of Henry Berkeley, has written a dissertation called Perfection in Christian Ontology. I think that's a very realistic title for a theological work from this time. This album comes with a booklet, and the text in the booklet shows some very interesting formatting. The lyrics to the songs are on the right and printed a bit smaller. And there's sort of a prose text, a narrative version of the story in the left margin, a bit bigger than the lyrics. And this story always has, or the text here always has the right length, so that the story will always align with what's going on in the lyrics on the right, which is kind of cool. The prose text on the left is pretty self-contained. It's written entirely in this rather old-fashioned style, I would say, so it reads a little bit like a synopsis of a journey, which itself could have been written in the 19th or maybe the early 20th century. And because this text is so cool and is a little work of art in itself, I'm just going to read it out here. So what follows is my version of the prose text, which accompanies the lyrics in the booklet. Here we go.
In 1864, Henry Berkeley, a 26-year-old English academic preparing a dissertation on perfection in Christian ontology, discovered logical inconsistencies in his academic theories which threatened to undermine the very nature of his own personal beliefs. Having these inconsistencies publicly revealed by his colleagues at the time was to him the height of derision. Within months, he had secured passage aboard a ship headed for Palestine in an attempt to verify the historical accuracy of the scriptures and to seek out a firm justification for his own faith. As soon as he arrived in Palestine, he hired a guide and set off for Mount Nebo so that he could view the promised land just as Moses had done right before his death. From Mount Nebo, he crossed the Jordan Valley and headed into northern Palestine along a road near Megiddo, which followed the edge of the field of Armageddon, the site of the Great War, which the Apostle John prophesied in the book of Revelation. He camped under the shadow of Mount Carmel for 3 weeks, exploring the surrounds, absorbing the local culture, and making notes comparing what he learned with the scriptures. In the first days of 1865, Henry Berkeley headed south, making his way towards the Mount of Olives and the ancient and magnificent city of Jerusalem, the site of so many events leading up to the execution of Christ. This is where his beliefs would be sorely tested. His first stop upon reaching Jerusalem was the site of the Garden of Gethsemane, at the base of the Mount of Olives, directly across from the walls of the old city. He then headed for Mount Zion, to the remains of the house of Caiaphas, where Jesus was condemned before being taken to his crucifixion. Henry rejected the traditional site of Christ's empty tomb, and instead spent many weeks searching for a grave site near what some locals believed to be the place known as Golgotha. He believed that determining the veracity of the resurrection of Jesus would hold the key to the premise of his faith. Whilst excavating the remnants of an old cave, he happened upon some human remains, which he erroneously believed to be those of Jesus. Further investigation upon his return to England found them to be too modern. However, at the time, this was enough to fuel his doubts, and so, in his grief, he left his guide behind and fled through Jericho into the Judean wilderness, where Jesus himself had fasted 40 days and defied his tempter. Wrestling with his own inner demons, Henry ultimately overcame his doubts by realizing he would not find answers digging in the dirt, but rather by exploring his own heart. The beginning of Henry's journey had been inspired by the conclusion of Moses' travels at Mount Nebo, and he would now conclude his own travels at that place in the far south which marked the beginning of Moses' journey. The monks of St. Catherine welcomed Henry Berkeley, and after staying with the monks for only a few weeks, they set him upon their man-made steps cut into Mount Sinai, which they called the Pathway of Repentance. He climbed the mountain in the early hours so that he could witness the sun rise over Sinai, as many had done before him. Climbing through the darkness of night, into the light of a new morning.
So, just once again, in a nutshell, in case that was a little bit hard to follow. So our protagonist, Henry, has doubts about the historical accuracy of the biblical narrative. He's just written his theological book about Christian ontology. He's ridiculed by his colleagues for his personal faith. Then he decides to travel to Jerusalem. At one point in the text, he's literally digging around in the dirt at what he thinks could be the tomb of Jesus. And then he moves on to the desert, where he sort of has this revelation that it's all about feeling it in your heart rather than finding some kind of scientific proof of your faith. And then towards the end of the plot, he visits St. Catherine's Monastery, which, by the way, is the world's oldest Christian monastery. It was built in the 6th century. This monastery is located at the foot of Mount Sinai, and it also houses the world's oldest continually operating library. But what is more important, I guess, to the story is that there is this community of monks living there, and they welcome him, and they sort of send him on this little pilgrimage up Mount Sinai, where he then has a kind of mystical experience, you could say, which seems to rejuvenate his faith, or maybe bring it to a new level or something like that. Okay, so the first track, Night Fears Morning, begins with a very memorable doomy guitar riff. So this reminds me a little bit of The Cry of Mankind by My Dying Bride. So it begins with this very memorable guitar riff, which is then carried on almost entirely throughout the song. The lyrics here, we can read into them. So the first verse goes, "Take it all away. I have walked alone and wept in silent thought upon the cobblestone. They ridicule my faith, the learned of this rich establishment. I fear they hold the truth, that my beliefs are but imaginings. Night fears morning." So this is now from the point of view of Henry, sort of filled with enlightenment imagery there from the very beginning. So the light, right? The coming of morning here stands for, I guess, clarity, sort of knowing what's right and what's wrong, or what's true, what's factual. And it talks about his own fear of being exposed, his fear that, oh no, what if my faith is wrong and they can prove it to me, sort of. Right, in the second verse, I think it's kind of also interesting. It says, "Thoughts inside of me want to cease to be." I guess he's talking about his own doubts, maybe. And then the text continues, "This time they've gone too far. They've taken all my solemn dignity. This time they've gone too far. They tore the veil. The pain goes on. Night fears morning." I thought that was interesting. His thoughts, I think he's talking about his thoughts. His thoughts have gone too far. That might be that's an interesting feeling, actually, for a person of faith to have. Like, can my thoughts, my own thoughts, my doubts, whatever, can they actually go too far? Can it become dangerous for my personal faith if I think certain things? It's kind of an interesting thought to have. Okay, but it sort of encapsulates the struggle of the protagonist here, I guess. And then in the third verse, he already decides to travel. The key phrase here is, "The soil will hold the keys to unlock all the bindings of my heart. My dreams will be assured, veracity will have its daylight." Very lyrical here, very cool. So this is the call to adventure from Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. The soil will hold the keys. I must make my way, he says, to Jerusalem. So he hopes to find the truth about his faith. And the lyrics already point to this idea of the soil, of the ground. He wants to find the echoes from the ground, basically. Well, what should we think about this? On the one hand, I think it's very cool, very archaic. You know, the soil will hold the keys. Very mythological, figuratively or literally digging around to find the roots, to get to the root of the thing. It's kind of cool. At the same time, you could also say it's kind of cheesy, right? He's going to dig around in the dirt at one point, almost like a caricature of something. But at the same time, I mean, that's what 19th century people were like, as far as I know. So Charles Darwin, for example, also traveled around the world and observed things to refine his theories. So that's actually what was going on at this time. The British Empire was still in full swing, so there still was this fascination for discovering new things archaeologically, going to other places, and also, of course, biologically, in the case of Charles Darwin, linguistically, culturally, making connections between things and finding out the truth, rewriting history to a certain extent, finding out what really happened. It's kind of, really fits this time in which the story is set. Okay, moving on to the next track, Over the Sea. So in the first track, there was a line that I skipped. I must make my way to the Holy Lands, aboard a merchant ship to search with my own hands. So now Over the Sea, the second track, begins with the arrival. For example, he says, with little more than my faith, I turned and made my way across the sand. And the track also talks about his obsession with finding out the truth there about his faith and about early Christianity and so on. So there it says, for example, making my way inland to the sights I have heard be spoiled. I seek echoes of the past, things deep within the soil, all my life, all my days, taken with the need to raise the dead. Okay, so he speaks of his obsession, his need to raise the dead, whatever that means. Sinai is also briefly mentioned here, which I guess is sort of foreshadowing the ending of this plot. Yeah, then towards the end of the lyrics, we have this light versus darkness imagery again. Away from the darkness, over the sea, my greatest fear is that this darkness has followed me. The doubts which had inspired my quest, I'm certain, were stalking me in this place, and were even now determined to steal my very soul. So yeah, basically this encapsulates the beginning of his quest once more. Okay, turning to the third track, The Chosen Land. So the lyrics read, "Over time they've forsaken that great war crime of the ages." What is the great war crime of the ages? You could ask yourself. I have no idea. Is he referring to the Crusades? What is the great war crime of the ages? And somehow people don't care about that anymore. So this is where he is camping under the shadow of Mount Carmel for 3 weeks, absorbing the local culture and making notes, comparing to what he thinks is true from the scriptures. Yeah, it's kind of hazy. We don't really know what's going on, I would say, here in the plot. But these lyrics speak a lot about war. At the same time, he says, "I dig and toil with bleeding hands and recoil at the thought of mine own sunken faith. My own heart is as hard as this land which has been chosen by the Ancient of Days." So yeah, just struggling a lot here with actually being there, being in this place, and he feels that this land is really hard. It also speaks of dust somewhere, turned to dust. And he likens that to his own interior landscape, let's say. I also kind of like it's really clever, right? My own heart is as hard as this land, and the land was chosen by God. It's also kind of the title here, The Chosen Land, which implies that his own heart is also chosen by God. So it's kind of it's very clever, the way this is written. Also, the way that this is reformulated here. So 3 times in this text, "I dig and toil with bleeding hands and recoil at the thought of mine own sunken faith." So the fact that his faith is sunken, so it's I don't know, buried by all of these new impressions, I guess. Then he says, "I rend the soil with bleeding hands and recoil at the thought of my life." And then he says, "I dig and toil with bleeding hands and recoil at the thought of these fields of blood turned to dust." In the bridge, he mentions war, the field of Armageddon, where he's standing. So he's basically realizing, I guess, that the history of Israel, the biblical narrative, just has a lot to do with warfare. I guess that's all I can really gather from this so far. Okay, moving on to the next track, "They Tend to Die." That's a very interesting title for a doom metal track. It reminds me very much of Anathema's title, "They Will Always Die." It's a very, very lyrical piece, basically a meditation on death, a meditation on mortality, which is inspired by contemplating 3 different scenes of the Passion of Christ. So, as I said, 3 different scenes from the Passion of Jesus. The first verse reads, "Our Lord's enemies, they found him in Gethsemane. They took God's only Son from the olive grove, and I decry that which is breathing tends to die." Then the second scene, "Our Lord's enemies, they mocked him as they bowed their knees. They put God's only Son in a crown of thorns, and I decry that which is breathing tends to die." And then the third scene is basically the crucifixion itself. "Our Lord's enemies, they killed him on a torture tree. They sent God's only Son to a lowly grave, and I decry that which is breathing tends to die." These scenes hark back to, I guess, Exhumed of the Earth, to songs like Injudicial and The Killing. So really a meditation on scenes from the Passion, with almost no connection to the rest of the storyline here, which is kind of interesting. The only real connection I can find, or the only line that sort of ties this to the rest of the plot, is the line, "I hope I can find you." So Henry wants to find out the facts about the life of Jesus. Yeah. Otherwise, yeah, it's very lyrical, very introspective, and just, yeah, imagines the passion of Jesus and then draws the conclusion that we all die. Basically, it's a reflection on mortality. Yeah, pretty self-contained, but it doesn't really contribute much to the storyline. So let's move on to the next track. The next track is simply titled I. Okay, so track 5 is I. The chorus simply reads, I have life, I have time, and so on. I have life, I have time, always repeated. Yeah, this is where Henry thinks he might have found Jesus' tomb. So it's the most kind of cheesy part, I guess, of the story. But also, yeah, where the turning point occurs. The lyrics read, I stood inside the cave by the mound of the skull, so sort of imitating the style of Exhumed of the Earth here again, by using words like the skull, to talk about the biblical places. Examined that which was interred. The bones in this grave were human and whole. My mind held doubts, but my hands were undeterred. The bones, smooth and white, had lain within the earth as eons passed overhead. I brought them to the sunlight, to view them with more care. The years passed, well, they were kind towards their dead. The years that passed, well, they were kind. Interesting, we get the sunlight imagery here again, the light versus darkness a little bit. And then the text ends with a spoken word passage, which reminds me a bit of some of the spoken word passages on Within the Ancient Forest, where he asked the question, did he truly rise from the dead, or could these bones that I hold in my trembling hands be all that remains of Christ? Okay, not much more to say about that, I guess. So, moving on to track 6, My Failing Heart.
Evil calls to me, reaching out to eternity. Evil takes away all the thing that I own today.
Okay, so the lyrics to track 5 ended with a question mark, and now track 6 is really all about Henry being plunged into the dark night of the soul, so to speak. He literally goes into the wilderness. This is, I think, really now the turning point of the plot. Yeah, the first verse, okay, is a bit in your face, I guess. So it says here, evil calls to me, reaching out through eternity. Evil takes away all the faith that I own today. Demons taunt my soul, throw my heart in this wretched hole. Jesus calls to me, I answer no. Okay, then the second verse basically talks about moving on from there. So I've passed through Jericho to the sands of Judea. That's literally where Jesus went and prayed at the beginning or before the beginning of his public ministry. So he's going there now. To travel through wild lands, seeking answers I fear, comma, God. That's kind of interesting, right? Seeking answers I fear, God. Also a bit open to interpretation there, of course. The chorus itself reads, my failing heart is cold onto myself. My own convictions have not been proven. My failing heart has called... How can you prove that somebody has been resurrected from the dead? By the absence of okay. Anyway, his own convictions have not been proven. My failing heart has called unto myself. It lives in hope that I might find my way. It hopes in vain that I might find my way. Okay. So the ending, or the third verse talks about evil takes away all the words I had come to pray. So basically the frustration of not really even being able to pray where Jesus prayed. Yeah, and then the text ends sort of mysteriously with a hint of the protagonist's transformation. So my failing heart is cold unto myself. My failing heart has called unto myself. It hopes in vain that I might find my way. It lives in hope that I might find my way. I've found my way. And that's the end of those lyrics. Which brings us to the final song on the final album, simply titled Echoes. So the context here in the narrative text is that he has now decided to go to this community of monks at the monastery of St. Catherine, and they will then send him on his little mini pilgrimage up the mountain where he meets the sunrise at the end. The first sentence is pretty cool. First of all, the music here is also, I don't know, I think it's one of those sort of funeral doomy, very, very slow parts again, which you might say harks back musically to Exhumed of the Earth, at least to some extent. The first sentence is very cool because it ties this song back to the first song, Night Fears Morning, namely, the morning has nothing to fear from the night. Okay, that line also kind of stands on its own in the booklet. Then we get parts of the monastery described here in the first true verse. So the burning bush where Moses spoke with his God, the chamber of skulls of the monks, the library of early Christian texts, and then the pathway of repentance, which is steps cut into rock by monks so they could climb to the peak and commune with their God. All of these things, I guess, are really features of the monastery of St. Catherine. Yeah, and then he climbs up these steps on his final pilgrimage here, and the last verse reads, "My soul had hungered for the truth throughout this aching quest. As I watched the sun rise over Sinai for the first time in my whole life, I realized it shed its light not only on the earth, but also on the darkness of my aged heart within. Now was the time to shine." And that's the end of the lyrics. That's the last line. So he has refound some kind of faith, we must assume. Both the prose text as well as the lyrics are not really clear about this, so it's really open to interpretation. It's very, very symbolic. He's climbing up some steps to the top of a mountain, and then the sun shines, the sun rises. But apparently, that's enough for him. So this text talks about a mystical experience, an embodied experience, a pilgrimage, and also of community. So these monks have welcomed him into their fold, basically. And he's lived there for a few weeks, it says in the prose text. Yeah, so rather than sitting and brooding over abstract theology, he has basically undergone this little pilgrimage, gone on this pilgrimage. This doesn't seem to resolve his intellectual crisis, I guess. We don't know. The text does not go back to his thoughts. The text does not go back to England, to the academic world that he left behind. We don't know how the people will react when he gets back, how he will react to them, I should say. The text simply talks about this mystical experience Yeah, this reminds me of that Einstein quote. Einstein is supposed to have said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." So basically, I don't know, this is my interpretation, of course, but I think this is all about him having shifted to this other mode, not trying to find his faith or proof of his faith intellectually, but rather in community, first of all, and then also through this little journey, through these mystical experiences, through this seeking out the sunrise, quite literally, right? So he was fearing the morning, but now he realizes, I don't have anything to fear. The sun is shining on him, and that's good, basically. Okay, and that's the end of the Paramaecium lyrics. Which brings me to the question right now of asking, is there a common theme to all Paramaecium lyrics? And I think there is. The common theme, whether we're looking at Exhumed of the Earth, Within the Ancient Forest, A Time to Mourn, or this album, Echoes from the Ground, it's always about life versus death in a way. And of course, it's somehow always about faith. Now, to say that is a very broad statement, of course, life versus death. Yeah, everything is about life and death. But that's the only really common theme that I could find. There certainly is a progression to the early works, talk about faith in a rather simple way, I would say. So to believe in Jesus is good, basically. Or in the world of Within the Ancient Forest, to submit to the authority of King Garen and to die to yourself is the way to life. This starts changing with A Time to Mourn, where the lyrics become much more personal. It's more about, I think I called it psychological integration on the last episode. It's about aging. It's about also being critical of certain forms of faith. And this whole album, A Time to Mourn, but it's also framed by this idea of life versus death, because we have life is a moment versus life is unceasing. And then Echoes from the Ground is a concept album again, a bit like Within the Ancient Forest, I guess. And it tells the story, it's also rather mature. It tells a story of somebody's transformation from a more intellectual faith to this community-based and sort of mystical experience, embodiment-based faith, if you want to call it that, at the end. It's very open, right, with the sunrise, and now is the time to shine. That's all we kind of learn at the very end. Okay, and then one final thought. Echoes from the Ground, being a concept album, for me, seems a bit like a version of Within the Ancient Forest again. Or Within the Ancient Forest and Echoes from the Ground have some parallels, which are really interesting to think about. So both of these texts are fictional, of course, but they're sort of autobiographical, I guess, in a way. Both protagonists, Denial in Within the Ancient Forest and Henry in Echoes from the Ground, both of them move from a sort of book-based educational knowledge towards lived experience. Another parallel is that in the middle of the quest, they're both sort of called to go into the ground, into a cave of sorts. And there's even another parallel. Towards the end of the stories, there's a stairway in both stories. In Within the Ancient Forest, the stairway out of the ground is basically a magical divine intervention to save the protagonist from his deadly enemies. Whereas in Echoes from the Ground, him going up the stairway is more of a deliberate choice. The stairway's already there, and he sort of decides to make this the final step of his journey. It's more symbolic. It's his own little pilgrimage towards the rising sun, which completes this imagery of darkness and light, I guess. Yeah, and the ending of Echoes from the Ground is more community-based, so it's more, it talks about these monks welcoming him to the monastery and then sending him on this pilgrimage again. And that's something that is sort of lacking a bit, I guess, in Within the Ancient Forest, if you want to compare the two in terms of that. Yeah, so those have been my thoughts on Echoes from the Ground.
So that's been my discussion of the lyrics to Paramaecium's final album, Echoes from the Ground. You know, the album that just doesn't get talked about that much. Wow, it's been a great run, several years. I've been doing this podcast. Well, not really. There was 1 year and then a long break and now another year. So yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that for now. No, not for now. I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you've enjoyed all of my ramblings here about Paramaecium's lyrics, particularly about Within the Ancient Forest, of course. Keep in mind, Within the Ancient Forest, the book is available on Kindle these days. Yeah, the first 2 Paramaecium albums have been recently re-released on vinyl and special edition CDs. And Within the Ancient Forest even as a cassette, which is kind of cool. So, yeah, I don't know how active Andrew Tompkins is these days. Ian Arkley certainly is active as a musician. Go and check out his project, My Silent Wake. They're really, really good. And I'll just leave it at that. Take care. And until we meet again. Bye-bye.